I'll break the awkward silence. We're waiting for, there we go. We were waiting for our online audiences to join as well. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming to the first panel discussion we're having as part of the Land Body Ecologies Festival that has kicked off today in the Welcome Collection building. My name is Babita. I'm part of the team at Quicksand. I'm based in India and we're part of the Land Body Ecologies team. We anchor the research in the India hub. Today we're going to be talking about land-based violence from very different perspectives. But before that, for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll tell you a little bit about land-based land body ecologies. We are the current residents at the hub in the Welcome Collection on the 5th floor of this building. So this is a 2-year grant where we have been exploring the concept of solastalgia. This was first coined by Glenn Albrecht, an Australian environmentalist and philosopher, where we're looking at the connection between environmental degradation and the distress that humans face at this loss of land, home, what you consider home. So we've been exploring this idea across 4 different hubs, across India, Uganda, Kenya, and the Arctic North over the past 2 years. And what we're going to bring to this panel discussion, as well as several other events over the 4-day festival, is to think about how this is expressed by communities, by people, by by non-humans, and to explore the various angles and the various threads to this incredibly nuanced and complex topic. And we're bringing one slice of that to you today. Before we start, I wanted to also say hello and thank you to our online audiences. Just a few ground rules. We are here to learn from each other. I would request everyone to be in an atmosphere of care and respect. We might have differing perspectives, but let's try and use language that is appropriate. There might also be topics and issues that we might talk about today that are sensitive and occasionally hard to hear. If you feel like you need a moment, please feel free to step out. There are folks who can help direct you out. But apart from that, I look forward to a meaningful and relevant discussion today. So I just wanted to start about thinking about land-based violence and how we're talking about people and communities whose identities, culture, language, and often their very sense of self is rooted in land. And today we're going to talk about what happens when people are displaced from there, and often the very unfortunate circumstances that cause them to be displaced, and the trauma that results from it. The places that we're working in through land body ecologies are contexts where communities, animals, the larger ecosystems are facing traumatic change that's often detrimental to their own health. Through our work in LB, we've been looking at stories that illustrate and embody the various threads within this trauma of displacement and the inherent hope that exists in rootedness to place and home. So the place that I work in India, for example, Iruligas have faced evictions from their forest and their homelands due to several reasons, and they've lost their sense of identity and incredible loss of heritage and cultural practice. This violence might play out in different contexts, in different ways, and are often caused by various agenda, but we wanted to kind of talk about some of that today and bring in perspectives that we might not always consider. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker today, Aisha Ahmed, who is the reader in Global Health Humanities at St. George's University of London, and she's also a core member of LBE. So Aisha, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Babita, and thank you for attending tonight. It's nice to see new and familiar faces. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing my first slide. Okay, it's up to you. For the moment, I'll talk about land-based violence and it's a privilege to introduce this notion to you today. It's a term that has arisen through our work. We've often been talking through our hubs, in many different forums, in person, online, even on WhatsApp, trying to explore our experiences and our perspectives. And from that, we really believe that this term is a co-story term that has been born from the reflections during these last few years, that we are trying to anchor in academic frameworks, but to think about how these stories can be used to create the audiences that we need. So even though it's a difficult topic, land-based violence does not sound such a beautiful term. It is a term that we hope that will lead to paving the way to a greater recognition and respect for the stories of suffering that we are hearing from our collaborators and colleagues and our communities around land-based violence. I've opened here with a quote from one of our colleagues who was very kind to be able to give this quote to this talk tonight. And it just arose during an everyday conversation. It was not anything formal, but I thought that it was a really poignant starting point for introducing this term of LBEV. And she said, in reflection to some of the recent media and news stories that has been publishing, and she's been reading about the homeland and what is being done by to her homeland without the community's consent or will. And she said, I feel like I'm a victim of physical violence. My body is hurt when the land is invaded, harmed, or destroyed. And we spent some time trying to think about a segment of this conversation that followed about the shame that she felt and how she could not understand that she feels a shame even though nothing has been done physically that is violent to her, but has been committed towards the land. So this is a opening to the question that we're exploring about what does trauma mean to the land, for the communities and those who are connected to the land. And we put some terms here. I'm not going to be reading all of this text, but thinking about the observations that we have been developing in our work related to land-based violence. So we've been, of course, exploring broadly about mental distress and environmental change and land right issues, but specifically within that, thinking about what are the solastalgia related harms of the hubs that we are connected with. And hand in hand with land-based violence is the notion around land trauma. And these concepts have been reflecting the ways that communities that we're working with have been narrating their experiences of both transgenerational and contemporary traumas and violence that they explain are happening to their lands and to themselves simultaneously. There is no differentiation between the land and the self. And in that sense, the well-being of our communities is impacted. And we're trying to turn the tables a little bit on how we understand this trauma, that the mental distress is not because the physical or the physical situationness of the person is suffering, but because of the perception of the way that land is being harmed, causing the mental distress. So trying to look more deeply into the kinds of connections that these communities have to the land. And the idea, the sentiment that if the land is negatively impacted by environmental change, that the land incurs a harm. A little bit about the violence. Some of the context for this term has been in how, particularly in my research, which has been looking at gender-based violence in conflict and trying to mirror some of the ways that we've come to understand through seminal conflicts in the last few decades about the ways that the body becomes entangled with the land, and the body is often targeted through systematic violence in conflict as a way of attacking the land, or the way to get territory ownership or possession of the land through the body. So trying to think here as well of how this ties in with the ways that predominantly in health we think about violence that is committed towards a person by another person. But what does it mean if we shift that paradigm to think about violence towards the land? And that's what the stories of solastalgia through our hubs have been pointing to. So our call here as well, thinking about our audiences for health organizations, to include definitions of violence to apply to the land as a form of harm to a living body. We wanted to think, as I mentioned, about land, connection, and self, thinking about how we form these connections, how the land and the self communicate is through stories. And Babita was bringing into light about the role of stories for our research. And I think this is a key point about the LBE's work in the storytelling, and what this can help us describe about the lands and the experiences of the communities, whether these are forced evictions, destruction of ancestral lands, artificial constructions. So thinking about not just environmental change as a blanket term, but what are the particular stories of suffering within that, and the different lands as well. When I'm referring to land, I'm not just referring to what's beneath our feet, but what it is that we connect to in terms of where we situate ourselves in terms of home. So to conclude, our focus as we continue our work is to weave the land into these notions of health and harm, to think about when someone is displaced, either physically, psychologically, existentially, phenomenologically from their land, how that harms that individual and that community's well-being, and how we can understand from humanitarian as well as health and medical and psychiatric as well as legal perspectives these kinds of harm, so we can represent these stories adequately in our quest for justice. And well-being and healing, I wanted to mention, are the antitheses of land-based trauma and land-based violence. I wanted to try to end on a positive note. So when we're explaining about land-based violence and land-based trauma, we are talking about suffering, but we also, the reflections of suffering is because it's coming from a place where the community knows what their healing is. They know what will make them healthy. But those experiences have barriers because of the systematic violences that have been employed to their land. So even though we're talking about trauma and violence, it is not all lost, because we are also talking about, well, this is what we need in order to feel health and to have well-being. Yes, and that was, I'll end there, that was my final point. But thank you very much.
You might have to go back one slide. Thank you, Aisha. While we figure that coming up. Our next speaker is Vishala, Vishalakshi Padmanabhan. She's the founder of Buffalo Back Collective and has been leading a lot of the organic farming work in India, and also been working in Asia. Vishala.
Thank you, Babita. Yeah, I'm from India, Bangalore, and I live in one of the hubs, which is part of the LBE, where we worked quite extensively with the community on various perspectives. But before that, I think I should also tell a little about the work that I've been doing for the last 15 years, which has been mostly around making sense of farming and food systems in a very larger, but there are various layers in which we've been working, but then where I have placed myself largely is in what we call as advocacy, in making alternate ways of farming or sustainable ways of farming work for farmers in India, and specific to the context in which different farmers, communities work in our country. So for that, we have been using a specific tool, more an economic tool that's used by both the market and the farmers, which we call as the participatory guarantee system. So one of those systems which was a response to industrialization of organic farming also, because organic farming started as a movement. And if we can, I'm sure most of us are familiar with a green revolution that happened across the world, where chemical-based farming was introduced to increase the food production. And the promises that this revolution held were phenomenal at that point in time, and probably they served the purpose also, considering that places like India did report scarcity of food at that point in time. But then eventually, over the last 20, 25 years, there has been an acknowledgement by communities, by practitioners, by farmers, that it is not serving its purpose anymore in many ways, not just about increased production, but then the depleted resources has been increasing the cost of farming, increasing the difficulties of farming, and access to resources, like key resources like water and good quality soil. So with all these acknowledged, organic movements started as an alternative narrative to a chemical, largely commercialized food production system. And but then as the movement started growing, the risk of this movement turning into another industry or another sector, I think most of us today also look at organic food as another commercial product. So it was important to keep certain narratives alive and talk about soil or seeds or water being critical, important, community-owned resources, even when the final output as food is a commercial product. So we've been trying to keep this, this narrative active through various ways, and one of it is the guarantee system that we work on. So that apart, the other layer that I work on is the place that I live in, which is Ragihalli, which is between Bangalore and the Bannerghatta National Park. I just tried to take a Google map image to give a perspective of where we live in. So there is a city, Bangalore is probably one of the largest growing cities in the world at this point in time. And then we have the Bannerghatta National Park, which was identified and demarcated as a national park to protect certain specific keystone species, fauna and flora, and also to serve as the elephant corridor for the elephants which move between certain spaces there. So it's called, in India, these spaces are called as ecologically sensitive zones or buffer spaces, which protect this national park from the developing city. So we have certain specific challenges, specific advantages also of being in a place like this. So I live there, so connecting my larger interest in food systems, agriculture, and trying to make sense of better systems, we were trying to look at our own place a little critically for quite some time. But then when the LBE project started, I think I learned a lot. And there's been definitely a lot of new perspectives developing. So we registered a small not-for-profit trust along with the local community with certain value systems in place. So it was all discussed between us, and we said there are specific ways in which we'll work, and we'll make sure that all our work is sensitive to the place, the people, and the communities living there. And so understanding or linking my larger work with soil and seeds to land-based violence was something that I learned very recently. It's not something that I thought about, because the focus on soil health has always been around nutritional security of food and making better economic sense for farmers and reducing their dependence on chemical inputs. I think that's all the focus was. But then in the last 2 years, I have learned to connect it to the larger well-being of people and how actually better soils definitely have an impact, positive impact on people. And how actually, and in fact, we have certain cases in our country, not in my place, but in a state called Maharashtra, where farmer suicides are quite a normal event to happen, where farmers are dying because they take their lives because their soils are not responding anymore, not responding to any amount of fertilization and any amount of efforts put in from them. So this is definitely a kind of violence that we have done. We have depleted our resources to a very large extent. So it was important for us to start our conversations around soil and make certain assessments. So we did certain interesting activities of all of us learning to analyze our own soils with certain experts coming, explaining to us about the physical qualities, the biological qualities of soil. So we started with first understanding what are the things that we have lost in the last 20 years in our community, or what are the things that we have kept, and where are we great. So we started with all that and started talking about soil to understand if perspectives will change and people will have something, feel better with better soils. We are still experimenting. I would say we are still learning a lot of things. We are still trying to figure out if people are feeling better when their soils are getting better. But some of it is what I will show now, some of the little things that we have done. Probably before that, I'll set the context on what exactly has been done over the last 20 years. So one of the primary concerns of people living in an elephant corridor is the conflict that they face with the elephants. Probably Nishant will tell more about that. But that becomes their primary fear to with their response. So the risk mitigation strategy first is to keep the elephants away. And one solution that was offered there was to do sericulture, which is a monocrop plantation, cultivation of mulberry crops, and then rearing the silkworms. It's an economically very viable activity, and because it's been done for the last 25, 30 years, there is a brilliant market system which has evolved around. There are traders, there are people buying it, so the farmers do not have to go looking for markets. But that has depleted the quality of the soil because the farmers are no longer doing multi-cropping, they're no longer growing different things on the soil, which means that the biological properties of the soils are very limited. And also, we have mostly small farmers because we have different kind of communities living in our village. We have certain semi-nomadic communities who don't actually own large pockets of land. They have very small land holdings. So fragmented and small land holdings has its own challenges. Achieving an economy of scale in doing anything becomes quite a challenge. It feels like you're working really hard to take care of a small plot of land. So that's another block that we have. And another, it's all these get linked to each other. So once people are not fertilizing their soil with their own recyclable material, the livestock population comes down. They no longer have cows, goats, and hens like the way they would have before because they don't see use for them. These plantations don't need too much of those. So one is reduced livestock, which leads to its own issues. There are nutritional security compromised, and there are various other things that the women go through. And this, I think, over long-term plantations have led to increased usage of weedicide is something that's been accepted in the whole agriculture cycles. Because the weeds get a little more resilient, and then you see newer kind of weeds coming up, and then people are struggling to control them, and weedicides offer a very easy solution. And weedicides are known, especially glyphosate-based weedicides, are known to have their own impact on both physiological health and mental health of people. Of course, some scientific reports also confirming it. So with all this happening there, we just decided, let's try out some responses, very small experiments on seeing how can we make things better. So it's as recent as in 2019 that we started. We just, India has certain laws or certain policies which support certain community-based organizations. We call them self-help groups. We call them farmer-producer organizations, which are all based on cooperative principles, where people come together. So we started talking about those. We started looking at ways in which we could organize ourselves, because other than community organizing around their, we have a caste system still. So people from farming communities organize themselves, nomadic communities organize themselves. So we were looking at exploring the possibilities of newer ways of reorganizing ourselves and looking at how do we make better sense, optimize things so that we are focusing on the soil health of our place. So these are some of the experiments, and in the process, we started a small bakery. I will show some photographs, and the two ladies standing in front of a board is a farmer field school, where we started looking at how can we make certain compost, even if we don't have enough cows. Can we think about vermicompost? Can we think about certain other animal refuse being used? So that's something that we are exploring. And the next picture is the women making cookies. They've learned to bake, and they learned to make some snacks. from the cereal crops that they're growing in small pockets of land at present. So we are exploring organic farming through growing and processing them and understanding that how they are much better than a chemically farmed product. Yeah, I think I have mentioned these challenges, so it's repetitive. Yes, I think that's about our story.
Thank you, Vishala. Next, we have Nishant. He's an elephant biologist and has been studying Asian elephants through the Frontier Elephant Program for several years now. Nishant.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Oh, great. Good evening, everybody, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and I should also thank you all for making me part of this panel, because I think it's high time we do address the elephant in the room. So what's happening? I think this photograph is quite powerful for me, especially. I took this photograph way back in 2011, and I very clearly remember that this was the last photograph I took that day. And that's because you see Revati there. She's an elephant who I've known for the last 15 years. And what I do is try and understand decision making in elephants. Why do they do what they do? And what do they respond to? And how do they respond to it? This was happening not very far from where Vishala, the location that Vishala spoke about just now. And it's a highly urbanizing area. It's what we call as the peri-urban or urban area. And at this point in time, Revati had been troubled by a group of people because it happened to be a weekend and all of the men had not gone out to work and they were all in the village. And she and a herd had come into a small eucalyptus plantation. It's a monoculture plantation. And they were teasing her. And at this point in time, this was the fourth or fifth time she came rushing to tell people that back off, I'm getting very agitated. And this particular time, she didn't stop. And you see the person who froze there, he was actually killed after this. But this is real. The violence here is real. And what I've tried to do with these incidents and with the land body ecologies is try and theorize what space, land, means for an elephant. Elephants are large ranging species. They need about 1,000 square kilometers of area to walk around in. They need about 200 kilos of food to eat every day, about 150 liters of water to drink every day. So they need a lot of space to walk around. Revati is about 45 years old, which means she has seen the land change over the last 45 years. She's walked around with her mother, with her aunt, who have known that area to have more forest than built-up areas. So this is something what I sort of theorize as her conceived space, the idea of what it was, the idea of when forests were there. And when they range in these areas are considered still to be part of their home range. The home range has changed structurally. It has changed in terms of the kind of people, number of people who are there, the kind of activities that are happening in that area, but still is part of her home range today because the memory is so strong of that area that she used to walk in. This is another case, very close to Bannerghatta again, where you see a group of young males and they're being chased away from a crop field. And what they're running into is not a forest, it's a banana plantation. But for them, structurally in that area, this is the only place where they can hide from people. So their perceived space, I spoke about the conceived space, their perceived space. Their perceived space is very much the organic space. It's the space that they can smell, they can see, they can touch, they can hear. And elephants' senses are much, much better than ours. They can pick up vibrations from the ground using their trunk. They can communicate using infrasound for maybe 10 kilometers. So if I'm standing here and easily an elephant can give a signal to another elephant 10 kilometers away saying that I'm here. They can communicate well. And so when there's violence on their land, imagine a saw cutting a big tree. The sound itself is multiplied many times for an elephant than what I can hear, you can hear. The call or a gunshot that's fired somewhere is very real for an elephant. It's much more magnified. And so the perceived space is what they can see today. And I think the conflict is not really when an elephant comes into a crop field, or not when it ends up accidentally killing someone in self-defense or being agitated. I think it's really its lived space. The lived space for them, I think, is a conflict between the conceived space of how it was and the perceived space of what it is. And I think that's solastalgia for the elephants. It's that memory, it's that loss, it's that idea of having lost that space or having it changed entirely. And so they tend to adapt. For instance, I mean, you saw this young bull who chased away the buffaloes from the water body that he likes to wallow in as much as the buffaloes do, much to the dismay of the buffaloes, watching this entire herd then come in and bathe in the pool. So what they do is also they are reimagining spaces. They're extremely adaptable species. So here's a case where Mac and P.T. Jr., two of the bull elephants that we study, have come and taken refuge in a very large water body in the middle of the village. There is no forest there. What you see behind them are areca nut plants, and you also see the high tension electric wire passing. What they do is elephants are supposed to feed about 18 hours a day, but they starve themselves for about 18 hours a day, and they go out only at night and feed from the crops that are around. So what has happened over time is that their idea of space is changing, and they're very happy to reimagine that space. The loss is there, the memory of which it is there, and they're trying to fill it up with newer memories. And while they do that, they also get into trouble, unfortunately. And elephants do get injured, they get hurt, they get killed very often. And most of this happens when they're trying to cross new areas. For example, a new highway that's come up. Every time an elephant goes around in its home range, they're known to build mental models of reality, of what it is. The rock, the tree, the smell of another elephant, the water body that's available, the food that might be available. But in that mental model of reality today are also people, built-up areas, fences, railway tracks, highways, electric fences, and electric lines. So they are under increased threat as we go into the future, I think. But I'd like to end on a positive note, which is, I think the adaptability is key here. And elephants, through their conflict, I would believe, are trying to show us that they are trying to negotiate as well. I think conflict for them is a means of negotiation. They're trying to say that there are certain things that are affecting us. I was sitting in the panel discussion today morning expressing ecological crisis. And I couldn't stop myself from thinking that this climate change manifested in terms of ecological crisis and conflict is so real, and it's in our face, that do we really need more evidence to say that ecological crisis is real, climate change is real, and we are impacting not just ourselves through this, but the non-humans around us. And when they get into conflict with us, the whole circle sort of coming back onto us. The conflict is upon us. So I think we're just making it more miserable for ourselves on this planet. And probably it's time to address some of the issues that these non-human beings are saying that we need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant. And now we have Kinnari Bhatt. Kinnari is the founder of Surya Advisory, has been working on human rights issues, particularly indigenous land rights. So Kinnari, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Babita, and to Land Body Ecologies as well. I'm also a trustee of Invisible Flock, so it's a real... I'm also a trustee of Invisible Flock, so it's a real pleasure to be here and to talk a little bit about my work. Yeah, it's a bit hard to kind of move from elephants to law and policy, which is what I which is what I work on, but I'll do my best. Okay. Yeah, just a little bit of background from where I want to kind of come in and talk a little bit around the kind of international climate negotiations and policy and what's kind of been going on, and then how that links with land and how that links with health. There are connections. In the last few years, there have been, the COP, the Conference of Parties 26 in Glasgow. Last year, there was one in Egypt, and these happen every single year. Underneath all of that, you have the what Vishal was talking about, the evidence that we need, which is provided by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change and the global scientists that tell us, what is going on, what the current situation is, and it's always, it gets worse and worse. So we have plenty of evidence, but we're still ignoring it. The IPCC produces special reports every few years, and in 2019, it produced a really interesting report specifically on climate change and land. And I'm just going to read a couple of things from that report here. So the IPCC recognized that insecure land tenure affects the ability of people, communities, and organizations to make changes to land that can advance adaptation and mitigation. It also said that limited recognition of customary access to land and ownership of land can result in increased vulnerability and decreased adaptive capacity. Most recently, in 2022, The Lancet published a really interesting article, and I put the link into these slides, and if anyone's interested, you're welcome to have these afterwards, which talked about the link between land disruption, planetary health, and strengthening land rights. And I was actually quite surprised to read it, because there's very little information looking at these kinds of what I think are quite disparate and quite fragmented connections. But essentially, the story, the research tells us, that things that we know, that many of the world's, biodiversity hotspots are also home to human populations, and we often forget that. They're situated in borderlands, these national parks, in very, very rich carbon reserves, forests, native ecosystems. And the Lancet article is telling us to look at the impacts of land disruption on things like human viruses, on health, and on how the law itself, and how we need to look at planetary health through a lens of strengthening land tenure and strengthening land rights, which is quite novel because it brings together issues around, spread of pandemics, viruses, carbon, biodiversity protection through one very concrete prism, which is protecting and strengthening land tenure. So there's a solution. And when we look at some of these facts here, I've written some of these facts, and you can have a look at them. I mean, I'm guessing that a lot of people here, we own a home, right? If we don't own a home, you lease, and you have, a short hold tenure over land. That gives you certainty, right? That gives you certainty that your home won't be taken from you, that you have registered title, and you have security. The majority of the world do not have those kinds of registered rights, and they live in what's called customary rights. And those are rights that are practiced through custom and through long-term usage. And from a socioeconomic perspective, people with those types of rights, they're called informal, for want of a better word, but they're called informal or customary rights, tend to be some of the most socially and politically, and because of that, legally marginalised groups of people. So forest dwellers, indigenous people, pastoralists, people that typically depend on land and natural resources for their lives and for their livelihoods. And those kinds of people are also most vulnerable to the different kinds of conflicts that happen over land. And when we're thinking about land disruptions, the Lancet article is telling us to think about those things. What are we talking about? And, you can think about the war in Ukraine, right? You can think about, on serious armed conflict and population growth. Those kinds of issues, and of course, climate change now is a multiplying effect on those kinds of conflicts. But that's not the whole picture. Encroachments in the kinds of countries that I work in are taking place a lot due to what I would term as indirect incursions on land, and those are happening more and more in remote areas for development purposes, right? So for things like extraction, for conservation, for extraction not only for the kind of fossil fuel extractions that we're used to, but it's a bit like old wine in new bottles. So the need for the critical minerals that make renewables, that require the development of electric vehicles, electric batteries. These are new types of land incursions. Okay. I'll probably have to, because I've got about 5 minutes left, skip through a little bit. And so the kind of impacts that these projects and these incursions are having, when you look at it through a kind of a human rights lens, there are quite a few, and I've just listed a few of them there. Rights to life, right to culture, right to property, right to food and water. When we're thinking about climate action, this term kind of climate justice is a term through which you can bring together all climate action to say it needs to be conforming with international human rights instruments. And some of these rights here around, the right to health, I think we need to think about them a little more broadly. So the right to health, the right to a clean and healthy environment. The British Medical Journal has, recently picked up on the UN General Assembly's declaration that everybody has the right to a clean and healthy environment. So we're talking, around things around, air pollution. But there's when you're looking at indigenous communities, there's also an area that's really not being picked up that much in the law, and that's around the trauma and the loss of cultural attachment to land. There has been a recent case in Australia where the courts have, for the first time, recognised what they've called, well, in very uncolourful legal terms, we call it non-economic loss, but the judgment, the courts have said that for native title holders, so Aboriginal groups in the Northern Territory, the High Court, after a whole load of appeals, upheld the decision that a native title group should be given compensation for what they called in the judgment solatium losses, which is that extinguishment of the cultural connections to land. And I've called this talk Punching Holes, and the reason I call it that is because there's a nice passage in there, which I'll just read to you, which said that the court held that the act of granting development leases which were not compensated punched holes in what could be likened to a single large painting, a single and coherent pattern of belief in relation to a far wider area of land. And this is quite interesting from a legal perspective. When we're talking about violence, there's different types of violence. We have direct violence, we have the kind of encroachments, gender-based violence, we have increasing criminalization of people that defend their rights. So women are raped and there's murder, there's people being thrown into jail without due process. So that's the kind of direct violence. But then there's also what you can call structural violence, and the law is very much involved in that, right? It's where people do not have access to rights, they don't know their rights, or where there are rights, for example, in countries like Australia or Canada, which are meant to be more mature legal systems, the rights the indigenous rights that are given are still very, very limited, right? So they're not equivalent to, a freehold or a full ownership right. So the inequality is baked in, and that's a form of structural violence. So let me just wrap up because I don't really have that long. I'd like to talk a little bit about one community. So I'll be traveling to Mongolia at the end of August to work with a few political scientists, and we'll be going to the South Gobi to work with some pastoral communities there to conduct a pilot study to find out what their needs are and what kind of legal options could assist them. So a little bit about Mongolia. Mongolia is a really interesting country that kind of falls off the radar a little bit. It has two of the world's largest mining projects and is Asia's key mineral producer. A large chunk, around 30 to 40% of the population, is actually nomadic pastoral. And some of the key minerals that have been found in Mongolia are copper, gold, zinc, iron or lead, and there's a wealth of natural resources as well. And the government has, like a lot of countries around the world, been busy granting away commercial development leases, conservation, energy projects. Hydroelectric is a big one where it's seen as a greener form of energy, but it causes massive displacement and potentially flooding and soil erosion. So communities in that area have been so we're going to the South Gobi, and we're going to the location of the Ayatollah copper and gold mine. Communities in that area have had serious problems around environmental and social harms over the last 5 or 6 years, and they've been using a form of private redress grievance mechanism that's been set up by the companies, the shareholders, and the financiers of that project. And what we're trying to look at is what other options those communities could have, because they're dealing with some serious issues around pollution, and loss of water rights, loss of land rights, lack of participation, and lack of free, prior, informed consent. I think I'll just wrap up there. But I guess just to say that, there is a need, I think, for us to be thinking a lot more in research and in policy around secure land tenure and strengthening land rights as a solution, and actually as a very cheap solution. If we're going to be quite frank about it, it's actually quite a cheap solution to issues around health, around biodiversity, and around basic fairness and human rights. And it's important in the climate justice conversation that people, and the most vulnerable people, are really placed at the front and centre. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinnari, and thank you, all four of you, for at least beginning to unravel multiple elements of what we're thinking about when it comes to land-based violence. Aisha, maybe if I could start with you, and what you've attempted to frame through the phrase land-based violence, sort of maybe moving away from mainstream notions of trauma and suffering. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what it means? How do we effect change through maybe thinking about it in new ways? And yep.
Okay, thank you, Babita. So some of our earlier work started to explore the ways that around trauma theories and trauma studies, and particularly about how trauma is translated into diagnostic criteria in clinical settings in the UK, but in countries that then transport their frameworks and assessment criteria to other countries, such as the ones that we work with. And we found that we did need to start to rethink the ways that we explain or express trauma or receive the stories of suffering, particularly trying to change away from thinking about trauma in terms of past, present, future, but thinking about the space in which how our horizons and landscapes are altered psychologically through environmental change.
Thank you, Aisha. And we could talk about this a little bit more, but I also wanted to talk to both of you, Nishant and Vishala, about this more than human perspective with soil, with animals, with elephants in particular. We were talking about this earlier, and Aisha was talking about how violence is often conceived of as harm to a person, and how therefore it was important to bring in some of these other perspectives. So from the point of view of the more than human, when we're already struggling to talk about violence to the most marginalized people, how do we build a better case for that? How do we build a case for the interconnections? You can choose to go in whichever order, whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I have been learning to actually connect soil health to the larger well-being. But then, of course, we have also, in the process of exploring these sustainable and alternate options to soil health, we have heard certain stories which may sound anecdotal, but then I think they are extremely relevant on how people who living in places where the soil carbon or soil microorganism levels are higher are actually doing better off in terms of their health, in terms of being happier or more content in being with their place, as compared to people who are stressing their lands, or rather, pressurizing the soil to perform beyond its capacities by using probably synthetic fertilizers. So, in fact, I did read somewhere about some perspective where water bodies or rivers are being asked to be treated as a person in a very legal context also to make sure they're protected. So there have also been cases where civil society organizations are talking about soil being treated as a living entity and not as something that we could use the way we want. So I think some of these narratives kind of establish the link between human health. And another thing which has been scientifically linked, of course, is that human gut microbiome is so closely linked to our soil microorganisms and then it's also linked to the mental health. Gut health is supposed to have a direct impact on our mental health. I think if we could connect these dots and make these connections of soil and earth being looked at as a living entity and our gut microbiome so dependent on the food that grows there and our mental health linked to it, it does feel like, it makes a lot of sense and a lot of sense to invest on our soil and make it better.
Thank you. I have, well, let me put it in 2 points. One is, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's more life. We're affected by not just our actions, but what's happening in the environment. It's always been a struggle to bring in the non-human on for a discussion, because also at some point you feel that, I'm not an elephant, so why am I speaking for an elephant? It's just that you've been with them for such a long time that you would want to tell their story. That's important. I think the way forward would really be, in terms of, I'm coming back to design, is to have a more than human-centered design. I think that's key, because I'll give you a very simple example for this. We have various departments. We have the agriculture department. We have the urban development department. we have the forest department, we have many, many departments. All of them are doing great or trying to do great in their own specified fields. So for example, the agriculture department, the highest priority for them is to increase yield, productivity, and ensure that there are markets and farmers get the crops sold in the markets so that they can get the revenues. So what the agriculture department would do is come and check the soil irrigability index and say this soil is very good. You can actually grow bananas here. And they will say, grow a lot of bananas. And they'll go. Now they've done their job. Nobody has seen that this particular land is next to probably the largest population of Asian elephants in the world. And elephants love bananas. So they're going to come and eat the bananas. So, and the forest department at that point in time is not there to say that, please don't do this because we have a population of elephants here. Maybe a different crop could work. Maybe a mixed crop could work. Maybe other crops that people think in this region will work because they've lived with elephants for such a long time could potentially work. No, because you're subsidizing a commercial crop, and so there is some interest in people now that because you're given the crop as saplings, also you're given subsidies on top of it. So in some sense, you're brought into that market and that rat race to really produce for a particular reason. So I think that's where really the indigenous knowledge, communities who have lived alongside elephants for the longest time, they really know what can be done when you have an elephant next to you. And that's where I think the alignment between different departments is so important. And that should be fed from two important knowledge systems. One is that of the elephant, or let's say the non-human. The other is actually the communities that are living there. Both of them, their voices are not there most often. The decisions are made somewhere else. So the forces that are acting are at a different scale. Well, I think it needs to be really bottom up though.
Thank you, Nishant and Vishala. Maybe building off that, a question for you, Kinnari. You talked about, particularly with indigenous communities, where the relationship to land is relational and complex and layered, when our departments can't work with each other, and when the reality of this experience and connection to land is so complex and layered. How do we bring in an additional layer of complexity with trauma, which is hard to express in the first place? Yeah.
I mean, through the law, you mean through the law? Yeah, I think the law can be a blunt instrument, right? The law, the law, it depends what type of background, legal culture that you're from. Different countries have different legal cultures. But in common law countries, generally speaking, there is the idea of a purposive approach to law, right? So you can develop the law and you bring in experts and you can push the envelope, right? So who would have thought 50, 60 years ago that we would have something like genocide as a crime against humanity? That's an example of pushing the law, right? So it really does depend on, you know, your legal culture, and then it's important that you have that advocacy and you have that momentum, and then you work to train judges, you know, you work to build capacity at the local level. So for example, you know, some of the type of work that I'm doing where, you know, you're working with communities or you're working with local lawyers and you're trying to help them to understand and join the dots. And say, look, there is a right to health, right? There's a right to clean and healthy environment. You may have it in your constitution. Ironically, a lot of the countries, you know, that you work, you know, we're sitting here in the UK where there is no constitution, right? We have an unwritten constitution. But that, we have, we have bills that go through Parliament, right? So we have a different type of constitution. We do have a constitution. In some countries, like in India, there actually is a very good constitution, right? So it's a case of looking at what the rights are and then seeing how you can develop that and bringing that in, informing communities, trying to bring in different types of evidence, expert opinions, different types of lawyers, different kinds of experts that can help to bring make that argument. And it's very slow, it's very incremental, and it can be very frustrating. But a lot goes as well to the types of judges you have, right? And the kind of whether you have a judiciary that's willing to listen, that's willing to be more propositive, be more creative, and that is an issue of legal culture, and it's an issue of closing spaces of civil society, which is happening more and more in the world. This, public interest litigation in India 30 years ago was an amazing thing, and now there is very little room for it. But it doesn't mean you don't do it, right? You still try. You may get nowhere. Yeah.
Thank you. We can, I think, now open up for audience questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And please do wait till we bring the mic up to you, because to make sure that everyone can hear properly, including those who've joined us online. So if anyone has a question. Maybe we can start with you.
Hi, thank you for a lovely presentation. I have a question to all speakers. Hello, can you hear me now? Yeah. I have a question to all speakers. Do you think there is not enough academic involvement into the political debate, into this discourse? Because my impression that a lot of research is produced within academia, but somehow it remains within academic walls and doesn't go enough further to change the discourse that is urgently needed. Thank you.
I can tell about the agriculture perspective in India. Less than 2% of the funding for research goes into organic farming research or sustainable methods. So 98% of funding goes into figuring out solutions which the larger systems has already adopted and just making them better. So you can imagine the amount of effort and commitment that's going into academia.
Yeah, I would say perhaps more critically that there needs to be some ownership on academics about who they involve in their research and what they want to do with the research. That is not just to get publications with a new idea, but to actually use it for an ethical purpose.
That's a great question. I mean, I'm a practicing solicitor and I have a PhD, but I've left academia because I think, certainly from a legal perspective, I think Aisha's right. There's, academics tend to work in a silo, right? And they produce work that is potentially only read by a handful of people. I think the pressures of academia are such that you are producing for a very small number of people, but there is also a need, to make that academic work more practical, right, and to make it more understandable and to make it policy orientated. The incentives in academia are not there to do that, even though academia I think is quite good at saying that we want to do that, right? Because it shows the I word, which is impact. But actually, when it comes to it, that doesn't happen. And that's a shame, I think. But so in terms of the legal work, there is a problem in the sense that where academia's quite good at showing the problems, right, and where there is a need for legal intervention. I think it's quite good at that, but then there is an impasse that there are very few people then want to take that step and go into the practical and actually then, using that to do the empowerment and to do the actual work. And because then I think academics at that stage get a bit scared, right? And they don't want to do it because it becomes maybe a little bit too real. Well, I'm talking about legal academics here. It becomes a little bit too difficult, or, you have to deal with real life problems. So, then it becomes hard. And then there's a gap, right? As then there's a lot of knowledge that I think then is not implemented. And then it's also hard to get the funding to do that, right? To do that important work. So I think there is a problem there with actually, certainly in the legal and the policy area. And it's a shame because I think a lot, even though I said law is a blunt instrument, I think it can do some wonderful things in an incremental way.
I completely agree with you. I think there's a lot more that I should be doing. When I started, I wanted to be somewhere deep inside the forest and observe an elephant and not be bothered by anything. But that's not the reality of it. The elephants brought me to certain places to conflict, and I had to engage with it. One of the issues is that you're dealing with a long-lived species, so the understanding the species itself takes time in the context that it is. And the changes that are happening in the landscape are so rapid that I always find myself lagging in terms of what to say or what to suggest as a measure that could improve things in the landscape. So that is bothersome. And hopefully with long-term studies, what one can do is really build predictive models so that we can, be in the game and be right there for the right thing. Yeah.
Ilan, did you have a question? No, I'll come to you next.
Thank you, Ilan Kelman, University College London, and very privileged to also be part of Land Body Ecologies. And thank you for this powerful and unfortunately terrifying panel. And the land-based violence that you've all so eloquently and poignantly articulated has also assumed that there is some modicum of nature like the forest. I'm curious what your feelings or experiences are about land-based violence in an urban environment like Bangalore or London. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So in my case, we've sort of brought the city to the elephant. It's right there. At one point in time, I mean, we should keep in mind that there's been a history to the interaction between people and elephants. The system is dynamic, so the land use tenures change, weather patterns change, behaviors of people and animals change. Having said that, we've had elephants coming very close to, or sometimes inside Bangalore city. And a lot of times it becomes inside Bangalore city because Bangalore city is expanding and we are including more and more towns and panchayats, administrative regions as part of the larger Bangalore city. We have a lot of pubs in Bangalore, and I think at some point an elephant will walk on to what we have called MG Road because elephants love liquor. They can do that at night, potentially, and some of them have tried to come in very much into the built-up areas of Bangalore. We've had elephants come into other cities as well, and the immediate response has been to move the elephant out as quickly as possible. The forest departments are quite well equipped with that. They have the trained elephants, the Kumki elephants, who come in with the veterinary doctors, veterinarians, and they dart the elephants, and they move the elephants out and take them back into the forest. Well, the urban, if it's developed, like I was saying, keeping in mind the non-human which is in close proximity to the urban itself, which will include dialogues with the various departments that are working there. So a very simple case of you laying a new highway, should we have corridors for elephants movement or paths or passages for elephant movement? So when you're discussing the plan for the flyover, if you include certain of these aspects, the issues won't arise. It's as simple as that in a number of cases. Yeah. But I'm not very sure if I answered your question.
I come from a very Bangalore and Bannerghatta context. Nishant has told most of it, but yeah, also to just add to it, the ecologically sensitive zones are supposed to be administered by a council, and the council is supposed to have larger representation, a multi-departmental representation. And what we know is that for the last many years, the council has not functioned. So we know that decision making is just happening somewhere else and not within this council. Yeah, I wish I could wish away Bangalore. I could push Bangalore away from where we are. We can't, not just that, but then we have also been hopelessly looking at a Bangalore kind of attitude coming into our village. By very recently we had somebody setting up a nice coffee plantation, a very old coffee plantation, but then reimagining it and using it as a cafe where and a place where people could come for to spend the entire day, and then the carrot or the incentive that's given is that you may also see elephants when you come here. So Bangaloreans are excited. So every Saturday and Sunday we see close to around 200 cars coming into our forest in the morning and leaving in the evening. And we are just helplessly watching all this happen. So Bangalore is on our face. Many of us don't like it, don't want it, but then we are what we are present.
And we were just talking, in fact, earlier about the flip side of this, where it's often urban notions of the pristine forest that's imposed on spaces that are outside urban, and often are the cause for violence itself. So yeah, that's also the other side to it. There's a question here.
Thank you so much. I'm Nikita Simpson from SOAS. I'm an anthropologist, and I also work in Dharamsala, which is also very much got hundreds of cars coming up from Punjab, and this kind of pristine idea of the mountains being projected onto the pastoralist community there, who some of whom are wanting to participate in that development, and some of whom are experiencing what you might call land trauma. And I'm trying to sort through that. So it's so amazing to be here and to think about it with you. I wanted to ask, though, about evidence, because I wanted to ask particularly Aisha, but also Kinari, what counts as evidence for land trauma? Because a lot of the discourse around evidence in other forms of refugee trauma, torture, things like that, puts a burden of generating that evidence back onto the person, having to show scars, having to show jump through certain hoops to prove trauma. So I wonder what kind of evidence you would expect for land trauma, and what the kind of ethics of that are, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you, Nikita. That's a really important question, and one that I'm trying to think about. I would say at this moment, as you point out, not much counts as land trauma, and one of the sparks to this notion of land trauma came from my work with refugees and asylum seekers, and reading their testimonies and seeing how references to the land, or even ways that they've been coping with the trauma of displacement and their conflict is not recognized, it's completely erased. It is looking for a particular type of evidence, a particular type of trauma that counts as a form of persecution or violence. So there's a lot of work to be done, not just in terms of thinking ethically about the evidence, but how to ensure that erasure of what we do have is not silenced.
Yeah, I mean, from a legal perspective, the onus is always on, you know, the victim to prove, right, and to give their story, and that's that can form part of a legal case. It could be quite strong evidential testimony, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Question here, and then Daniel. Yeah, you have to look at Dan, but I've seen your hands. Could we bring a mic here? Could you leave your hand up, sir, so she knows where to bring the mic?
Hi, my name is Sanjoy. I used to teach in University of Birmingham. Now I advise the UNDP. There is this debate has been going on for quite some time about the contradiction or the conflict between the romantic view versus the developmentalist view. So any kind of development anywhere in the world would necessitate that there will be displacement, there will be mobility, there will be migration, and there will be, whether it's internal or external. So I find Aisha Ahmad's presentation is absolutely brilliant, but I find that towards the romantic side, that any kind of movement, because development means you have to, people have to be displaced. In Odisha, I know, it took 10 years in India. It took 10 years to vacate the land to build a steel plant, which was done by China in 10 days. So there has to be some kind of a compromise, if that is the right word, compromise between this romantic view and the developmentalist view. That's the first one, and I will be very quick about the second one. The second one is about the rights of the people to develop. And development is a right, you know that. So here we are from thousands, the urban people apparently can go anywhere in the world, thousands and thousands and thousands miles away, brain draining themselves to millions of them going to America, to Britain, to Europe, to Australia. Whereas we want to put certain kind of people in our romantic viewpoint, certain kind of people, that is the forest people, in glass houses, and we want to museumize them, what I call, as if they cannot move anywhere, and they are kind of some kind of a museum to be put in, and there cannot be any development or mobility for them. So I think these are my questions in my mind. Thank you.
Aisha, if you'd like to respond. And I just wanted to also maybe clarify from having listened in that I don't think anyone was making a case for that, but Aisha, maybe you can.
Okay, I'll just make a reflection. Perhaps the desires that are projected into the notions of development through the example you gave are what is romantic, and that we should think more about what it means to develop.
I think it's a good point you're making. You know, we had 10 minutes to talk. You can't go into the complexities, but you know, there's nothing romantic about not having the right to self-determination, right? To not being able to make basic choices about where you want to live and how you want to live, and not being able to share in developments on your land, and you know, to be included in decisions that affect you and your life and your livelihood and those of your family and your well-being and your basic, you know, capabilities. So I don't think there's anything romantic in that. And in this type of work, it's not about saying that, you know, there's just one, you know, community is not homogeneous, right? Like even within, you know, if we all wanted to go now and go to McDonald's and buy something, we'll all want different things, right? So, you know, it's the same thing in any, you know, indigenous local community, and that is that having that struggle and having that conversation, yeah, that's important. That is self-determination. And you might find that some of the younger people in the group actually want a bit of let's go to the city and let's leave some of our pastoral livelihood behind, and let's, you know, and the older groups, you know, may not, or there might be some, but that there is a value, right, in doing that, and that is, you know, that is an important part of self-determination and the right to development. So I feel like your second question answered your first question, if I understood it correctly.
I'm Daniel Kobeg from Kenya, from Ogier community, and I've had very interesting stories. I don't want to discuss about elephants, but I want to ask a question about land, secure land tenure system. From your presentation, it was very, very clear, but for me, who have been struggling for the Ogier community in Kenya on land issues for over 20 years, even after winning land cases in African court and all that. When you mention secure land tenure system, my question is, when do we say we have a secure land tenure system while we are struggling to see how we can do conservation? And when government does not believe indigenous peoples are the best people to do conservation. We have tried, we have done. When they see it, they still believe we are not scientific enough to prove we can have a secure land tenure system. Maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I know the Ogier case, I know the Endoros case as well. Those are all very good cases where, you know, where you have a so-called success story where, you know, rights have been recognized by international courts, and then local courts have, you know, pledged to delineate and to register land, and then that never happens. And then you have, you know, further infractions and incursions for different reasons, for conservation and for commercial development, and it kind of goes on and on. When do you have secure tenure? Well, it's ongoing. It's you know, it's hard to say. It's, you know, it's a rule of law problem that we're, you know, there's no country in the world that has a perfect rule of law, right? So it's something that keeps, you know, we're all on a sliding scale, right? Of, you know, of opening and closing civil space. So I think that struggle is constant, and we. I mean, I'm working with the Pan-African Lawyers Union, and we're working on some of these cases in Tanzania, where we're now trying to, and maybe it's something we can talk about. We're trying to bring in different types of experts on exactly this point that you've mentioned, because of this argumentation that the Tanzanian government keeps using, that people that are, you know, having a pastoral livelihood are, you know, the biggest problems to the environment, right? And there are, you know, experts on pastoral livelihood, on ecology, on legal issues that, you know, we can bring in, and we can give expert testimony to say, no, you know, these are very neo-colonial tropes, right, that have been around for a long, long time and are still being used, but this is not correct, right? This is not the current scientific information and evidence, and then we have to put that as part of the evidence, right, in front of the courts. And as I said, it's incremental, and it's difficult. So when do we have secure tenure? We have secure tenure when people feel secure, and there's the pressures on that in different countries are constantly moving, and it's just, I think we need to just be vigilant of it. But we need a lot more. It goes back to the first, you know, the research and the advocacy and the empowerment, and we need more people to be doing this kind of work. Yeah.
Do we have time? If you can keep your question really short, at the back in the second last row.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about threat to indigenous land today. So of course there's still a lot of corporate and investor interests that want to take natural resources and other things for themselves. And I wondered if you thought the one way to protect this land was to give it an economic valuation and introduce it into a kind of a monetary cost type. So do you think that economic and monetary valuations have a place within the struggle of land rights, and what would you try and put a cost on?
Acknowledging that that might be a hard one to address in 2 minutes, but Kinnari, if you wanted to.
The case that I mentioned in the talk, Timber Creek decision of the High Court of Australia, is the most recent example to do that. There is a place for it, I think, but we need to be very, very careful. It's good because at least we can put a language to it. We can call it something, and we can we can have some recognition. But I think it's also a bit dangerous because the minute we start putting pounds and dollars on things, things that can't be valued. Yeah.
Time, and it's been thank you very much. I've learned a lot, and I'm thankful for all of you uncovering the many complexities of a topic that's hard, but that is very important to address and acknowledge and recognize. So thank you very much, and thank you all for engaging, both here in the room and online. We have 3 more days of the festival. Most of us will be around, so if you'd like to continue conversations, there's very much the opportunity to do so. Thank you once again, and good night.